Well, we always look forward to our spot of politics with Professor Jim Jost from the University of Newcastle, and this morning is going to be no exception with last Tuesday, Jim, the Palace letters, the fabled Palace letters that we've been waiting so long to see being released. And they've probably produced a couple of surprises. They've also raised the issue of republicanism somewhat, haven't they?
Yes, good morning, Jane. The release of the letters after a long court battle by Professor Jenny Hocking to get them made public, they're fully available. Anyone can go to the archives online and download them and read them for themselves and perhaps form their own opinions.
Easy as that, eh?
There's well over 200 letters, very detailed, between the then Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, and Buckingham Palace. The Private Secretary of the Queen, Martin Charteris, is the main correspondent. And it's really interesting what we learn from those letters is just how closely involved the palace was in what was going on at the time. I think
what kind of span do the letters cover? Well,
they cover from the beginning of Sir John Kerr's time as Governor-General to the end of his time as Governor-General. It's about 4 or 5 years. The interesting thing is just the amount of detail that's involved. It's very, very detailed. He talks about all sorts of things. So it's not just simply around the constitutional crisis of 75. It's also in the period before that and the period after that. He's lots of detail, right down to whether he should reintroduce the curtsy or how he should dress on a particular occasion. This is very fine detail. Mm-hmm. Why the palace needed to know some of this is, again, a matter of speculation, and people might like to read or not into the psychology of it all. But what's really significant is when it came to the actual constitutional crisis, certain things sort of disappeared. So the amount of detail was still there, but some things that one would have thought the palace might need to have known about, based on Sir John Kerr's logic, would have been the security crisis that was happening at the same time as the constitutional crisis. The security side of it seemed to just not get a mention in any serious fashion, and when compared with the constitutional crisis. What the letters show is the response from the palace was that they were increasingly supportive of Sir John Kerr, and one of the key things that happened was in one of the letters just before Sir John Kerr made his final decision to sack the government, the palace had sent a letter, and part of that letter had a quote from a former Prime Minister of Canada going back to about 1926 when there was a similar crisis in Canada, and the Governor-General, Lord Byng, refused to take the advice of the elected Prime Minister to call an election, oddly enough, and basically told the Prime Minister that he wasn't going to call an election because it was too soon after the next one, and he was going to give the opposition leader a chance to form the government, which he did, and the opposition leader became Prime Minister and then lost the confidence of the House, and they had an election anyway, and it was subsequently defeated. But what's really interesting is the quote from the Prime Minister put in place by the Governor-General of Canada basically said that the Parliament has to hold the government responsible and accountable, and if the government refuses to be held accountable by the Parliament, the Governor-General should make the government accountable to the people. This was also a rationale that Sir John Kerr wrote into his defence of why he did what he did. Now, it's quite clear, I think, that that particular passage that was quoted for Sir John Kerr gave him extra a sense of support that the palace was behind him on this, and it was an appropriate thing for him to do. We also know, not from the palace letters so much, but from previous investigative work, and the Conservative writer Paul Kelly and Troy Bramston, more or less, both in their book The Dismissal, demonstrated that a lot more was going on behind the scenes in Australia than was made public at the time, and that Sir John Kerr had gone outside of what was considered the conventional brief and was taking advice both from the Chief Justice at the time and from another member of the Australian High Court. So this was already known that Sir John Kerr was seeking ways of determining how he could act. When it came to the palace letters, what we learn is that similar advice, if you like, not directly, it was all between the lines. And
almost anecdotal, but not quite.
Yes. It wasn't sort of you should do this or you should do that, but reaffirming Sir John Kerr's sense that he was the person who had to act. He had to make the decision and he had to intervene. The issue, though, if we come back to that Canadian example, that happened in 1926 when both Canada and Australia were then formally dominions of the British Empire. And it was partly as a result of that crisis and partly a result of the Australian government in 1930 appointing an Australian as Governor-General and refusing to allow the British Prime Minister or the British government to determine who would be Governor-General, that the British government then moved the Dominion Acts, which ended the Dominion status of Australia, Canada and other parts of the then British Commonwealth. So the situation in the 20s, was quite different to the situation in 1975. Australia was supposedly an independent sovereign nation, and yet here we had the palace providing a degree of support, both moral and technical, to the Governor-General for him to have confidence in his own decision-making that it was appropriate for him to intervene and sack the government. So that's another dimension that is really quite concerning. It still exists. The reserve powers are still part of our constitutional makeup, and it sort of points up the fact that our constitution and the way in which it was set up with the Governor-General as its head was in 1901 to ensure that the British government had control or a point of leverage over the then new national government in Australia. After 1930, that was supposedly no longer the case, but the constitution didn't change to reflect that status. So what we see with the palace letters is, in effect, a dominion status mentality that it's quite okay for the Queen, that's to say the palace, or the Queen as Australia's head of state when she's in Australia, but as our sort of nominal head of state when she's outside, and the Governor-General as the formal head of state, that it's quite okay for one sovereign power, e.g. the United Kingdom, to provide advice and interfere, if you like, or at least influence the way in which a part of the Australian constitutional makeup operates. It's a real challenge, I think, to understand how we can change that in a way that allows the workings of democracy to happen. Having a Governor-General with the power to intervene, what one would think is not necessarily following the will of the people, although one can look at the events of 1975 and interpret them along the lines that Sir John Kerr did, that he was in fact following the will of the people, but it's a after the event justification. So he sacks the Governor-General, sacks the Prime Minister, and then after the Prime Minister loses, when he becomes leader of the opposition and loses the election and can't get re-elected, then it's proven, therefore, that the will of the people was in fact being served. It's, I think, very arguable.
Yes.
That in 1975, it was pretty evident to most observers that if the Whitlam government went to an election at any time from around about July 1975 through to December 1975, that they would get beaten because the country was in all sorts of turmoil. We weren't the only country in turmoil, but they were, incumbent governments were going to get punished. So it's a little disingenuous to argue, therefore, that the will of the people was being served when it was a foregone conclusion, more or less a foregone conclusion, that if an election was called, Whitlam would lose. The other thing, and I'll say this very quickly, the other thing that Whitlam, as Prime Minister, wanted to do in holding on in the way that he did in the constitutional crisis was, in his words, to break the power of the Senate to control money bills. And this is one thing that Sir John Kerr made very explicit in his correspondence with the palace, basically saying the Prime Minister is adamant, he's obstinate, he refuses, and his sole desire is to break the power of the Senate over money bills. Bear in mind that the British Prime Minister back in, I think it was about 1917 or 1918, broke the power of the House of Lords over exactly this issue, that the House of Lords, as the upper house, had no business controlling the money bills that were basically part of the House of Commons' responsibility. And the same sort of thing was going on in 1975 in this constitutional crisis. So Whitlam was sort of wanting to end that particular process. There are arguments on many sides of that equation, but certainly from the perspective of the lower house, where the government is formed, they should have the right to put the money bills through and get the authorisation of Parliament without the Senate blocking it. And one final point, Sir John Kerr basically said that the Senate denied supply. It didn't. Earlier in his correspondence, he talks about the Senate deferring to vote on the bills, and as it gets closer to the end of the crisis, he says they're denying. The Senate never denied supply, although that was its effect. It actually voted to defer debating and voting, which was a delaying tactic, which really put the crisis into boiling point. So,
wow. Well, thank you very much, Professor Jim Jost, for your insights in the Palace Papers, Palace Letters, and it rather sounds as though historians and maybe lawyers will have something to work on coming out of that.
2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.